Current situation of sea cables around the region and Corinth. What is it going to talk about if you as an opening?
I think I can make a statement around the industry and how they view the different regions now and how they act.
Possibly,
Yeah,
yes.
Talking about the challenges we're having.
Okay. It's main one. Yes.
Hello there. It's always interesting when with arrows and texts on microphones. Welcome to this workshop about fiber build-out in various regions in the world, specifically focusing on the Persian region. But we will also, as you will see, cover fiber build-out both domestically and internationally in other regions as well. My name is Patrik Feldström. I'm Head of Research and Development for NetNode in Sweden, running iAccess and other things, and I'm accepted to moderate this session. So the panelists we have here are from our right. It's Michael Kende from Internet Society. We have Al-Razera from IRNIC in Iran. We have Kursai from Kuwait. We have Colin All from Fiber to the Home Council Europe. And we have Tracy Hackshaw from Trinidad and Tobago. And each one of these people these persons will give, and first will start by giving an overview over their situation and what they are working with and their connection to fiber build-out. And after that, we'll move into a discussion on similarities between the regions, differences between the regions, what arguments are to be used when you want to build out, what problems there might be with build-out, and I hope to get an interactive session that also involves you in the audience. I would like to start by giving the word to Karin, Chair of the Fiber to the Home Council Europe, and please give an introduction.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. As Patrick said, I'm the chair of the board for Fiber to the Home Council Europe, but that doesn't mean I'm only focusing on Europe. We also have a global council, which have representatives all over the globe. In this specific region, the Europe Council covers it, and also the MENA Council covers it, so we do it together. I'm looking forward to the discussion later today, because I heard some rumors yesterday that some made a statement about, is fiber dead? No, fiber is not dead. I don't think we would be in this room if fiber was dead. And actually, we've never seen so many operators, so many countries, and so many network owners investing in fiber. Maybe not fiber to the home specifically, but in fiber networks, fiber backbones, and fiber between the cities, fiber to the offices, and so forth. I'm representing the organization which gathers fiber optic manufacturers and component manufacturers. Of course, we have a very profound technology background, but we also cover policy implications, regulatory issues, and investments. Investment focus is something that really is coming up now as one of the big target questions for us. So I'm happy to dive into that. Last week there was a report launched in the US stating that the US is much further advanced in fiber to the home than Europe and other regions. I think that's very interesting to see, and we do this in different stages in different regions. I think that's interesting to discuss. Europe is not lagging behind, as everybody says, but we do it in different stages, and we use different technologies to reach the end goal. And for us, that is definitely fiber to the home. So I'm happy to be here today. I will definitely dive into the other presentations and discussions, and don't hesitate to raise a hand and say a question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I also saw that report coming out, and of course that for a person in Europe, and specifically Sweden, that the report points out should be one of the best countries in the world, but according to that report, we were not at all. So that's something that we should talk about a little bit more. Over to you, Kasai. Can you talk a little bit about your region?
Sure. Can I do it starting?
Absolutely.
I have. Can you display that map, please? My name is Qusay Al-Shati. I'm from Kuwait Information Technology Society, an NGO based in Kuwait with advocacy on IT and the internet. I just have a map. And I'll be talking about our regional experience in the Gulf and the Middle East regarding marine cables. I have a map here. It's a bit, possibly it is not clear. If I take the case of Kuwait, we are connected to 4 marine cables. One we call it the FOG, and one we call it the GCC Falcon. And the other one is called the flag, actually, cable. And there is one direct cable between us and Iran. It's a marine cable that connects Kuwait and Iran. The importance of the marine cables for us is that they played a key role in lowering the access cost for the internet. In the 90s, for a dial-up service, we used to pay monthly $200 for a 56K. Today, we pay $600 a year for 10 MB. And actually on the mobile, it's 600 for 20 MB. So that's what the marine cables does. If we don't have access to the internet, there is no need to talk about internet governance and so on. That's it. The access is the basic thing. Now, regarding the marine cables, when the Gulf countries, that means the governments, did the first marine cable, which is called the FOG, they did for a capacity of 5 gig in the late 90s. And they did for voice. They didn't do it for data at that time. So it was useless for us, and it didn't help. But then came the private sector. And they invested in doing what they call the flag and the Falcon. The flag is around 1.25 tera, and the what we call the GCC Falcon is about 5 tera. Then we needed to make a regional connection with countries close to us, like Kuwait, Iran. And that cable has a capacity of 500 gig today, almost. And instead of going marine landline with Iraq, actually we went with Iraq through the marine cable, which is the Falcon. So we have a redundancy with Iraq through the Falcon marine cable. Not only that, strategically for us, we need a landline cable. And this is where we did the last cable between the Gulf countries, and which was called the GCC-X. And it was done originally because the Gulf countries created a power grid, a utility electricity power grid system, and they needed to exchange data through that. So they needed to do a landline cable. And strategically enough, it not only connects us through the Gulf, but it connects us also to the Red Sea, so we can have direct connectivity to Africa. And it has a landing point, one in Sudan and one in Djibouti. Now, for countries like Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran, where these cables does not connect us with the whole world. The maximum it can connect us with India and to Egypt, and possibly one of them, actually, the Falcon, connect us with Italy, the cable itself. That means we need to depend on other international marine cables like the Simway 3, Simway 4, and soon to be Simway 5 to connect us globally to the internet, which make us vulnerable when these cables, for example, is cut off. When a ship hook hits these cables and takes us out of the net. In 2008, for example, there is a famous, a well-known story about the Simway 4 and the Simway 3, where a ship hook did not only cut off Simway 3, it cut off Simway 4 too. And for 36 hours, Kuwait was out of internet connectivity. It means that these cables are not the sovereign right of the nations that it passes through if it's going through sovereign borders. It is also the right of other countries which they don't have because of their geographical location only to connect these cables. So what we need to do here is how we can create a framework, a public policy where these cables, which is layer one, the basic thing, without it there is no internet, no connectivity, no data, where all these countries, where if something happened to that cable or the operation of that cable, the accountability is toward all the countries that is these cables are serving. And this is an issue that we need to address, because when a cable cut off in the sovereign zones of Egypt, it is not only Egypt's problem, it is our problem too, but we'll suffer more. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed, at least from our point and this is as a security issue more important than IT security, in my opinion. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. So you talked about Kuwait being disconnected from the internet, but Sweden was disconnected from the internet in Kuwait, right, as well? Yes. So I think it's important myself to remember that what we're talking about is that what happens is that a cable cut impacts the ability for the two parties on both sides of the cut to interact with each other. Yeah. So next person, Al-Rasira. So what do you have to say about what's going on?
My name is Alireza Saleh, and I'm from .ir, the IR-NIC, the Internet Registry of Iran. Actually, I just want to talk. I'm not working at the infrastructure, but because I'm living in Iran, also I'm running the .ir. I have some information regarding the current situation that we have in Iran regarding the accessibility of the people and how they can connect to the internet. So technically, I mean, we have. I just want to tell people about the situation that we have and how people actually in a major cities connect to the internet in Iran. Most of the users using the ADSL up to 8 megabit per second are connected to the internet, but and they're using the coppers. And they're running ADSL over the coppers, and then it goes to the telcos, and then the telcos connects via and the telco connects to the backbone of the internet that mainly belongs to the government and through the fibers, and the fibers then goes out and they can access to the internet. Previously, we had one 3G operator in Iran that you can connect to the internet via 3G, and now we have two others that joining them, And now we are seeing that the fourth operator is coming, and they are going to build the fibers as a pilot project for 8 million Iranians that they connect them to the internet through fiber and the LTE that over the GSM. So this is the current situation of the accessibility in Iran, and also that the only problem that we have, according to the basic rules of Iran, all the infrastructures has to be belonged to the government. So that the private sector investment actually, that's not much, and most of them are belong to the government. So this is a thing that happened in Iran, and I think that if we want to see some kind of the changes in the infrastructure, that this has to be a little bit changed. Actually, there are some companies that running the fibers. One of them is the Ministry of Telco that actually runs the fiber, and also the Ministry of the Energy and the railway system. All of them has their own fibers, and they connect to each other. And actually, our entry points are from on the front down to Dubai, and we have two ups and one of them through Baku and the other one through the Turkey. So that this is the current situation. If that there is some more information you want, I can help you in the question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you. So what you say is that the private sector companies that compete with each other build services on top of the government-owned passive infrastructure.
Exactly.
But on top of that, you have multiple entities that actually provide this passive infrastructure, even though all of them are government controlled. So to some degree, there's also competition between those providers of fiber, right?
Exactly, and sometimes that they're just renting each other's the infrastructure. For example, that if they want to increase the capacity connecting to the internet, that if the Ministry of Telco wants to increase the capacity through the through the telco and through the fibers, then they rent some dark fibers from the railway system, and they run their own the things. And currently, I think, if I'm not wrong, currently there are 3 or 4 organizations that they have the permission to have access directly to the internet. One of them is the Ministry of Telco. The other one is the TV broadcasting company of Iran. The other one is IPM, which is the parent organization of the IR. And I forgot the fourth one, but actually there are 4 that actually connect to the internet directly.
Okay, thank you. So the next person, Michael Kende from Internet Society, talk a little bit about Africa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. So I wanted just to talk a little bit about the experiences and the work we've been doing in Africa. I started working on some of these issues before joining the Internet Society, and have continued, and we've been looking at barriers to connectivity within the region and setting up IXPs to make traffic exchange more efficient. But what I wanted to talk here is just go a little through the value chain of how traffic gets into Africa, starting with submarine cables. So on the submarine cables side, I think that the story is pretty encouraging. A lot of this information is from Steve Song, has a website called Many Possibilities that has some great data on the submarine cables, and he put together this history that you can go through and click through when the submarine cables came. And so it starts with 1999, there's nothing, no cables, all satellite. Then 2000, the first cable, but just the north, CME 3. 2001, SAT-3 on the west coast, 340 gigabits along the west coast, and then nothing, no new investment until 2009. And then now there's been an explosion of new cables and capacity. So in almost every coastal country has a landing point, or at least one, possibly 2 or 3. So an amazing story. And even better than that, a lot of these cables have open access conditions so that they're not just given to the current incumbent who can effectively not pass on the efficiencies, but I think I was working in the Gambia, and 5 ISPs have licenses now and own capacity on the cable, and anyone else who comes in is guaranteed to be able to buy capacity. So really an amazing turnaround in 5 years. One thing that's not happening, and this is kind of a theme, is there's not much measurement of the results, at least formalized. So I had a great story that you always want to hear. When I was in the Gambia, they turned on the ACE cable in the end of 2012. They turned on the ACE cable only for 2 days and turned it off. And I just met with someone, and he said, oh, you work on internet, maybe you can explain why I always Skype my family in Germany, and usually it's hard to get a voice connection, but for 2 days I could use video. And then it went away, and hopefully now it's back. But you know, I thought, well, that's a great story. They invested $700 million, and there's a great return in the speeds. But I've since then looked around, and no one has formally kind of given before and after what happened to the speeds that people are getting, what happened to the prices, how is this amazing investment paying off. So I think that's a theme. With all of these things, that it's great to put it in, but it's also good to measure to make sure that the results are showing. The next bit is terrestrial, and again, Steve Song on his website has this after fiber project that shows, and you can see kind of all of the capacity slowly moving in from the coasts, some of it directly connected to the CCOM or the cable companies, but moving in to the coast. Liquid Telecom just completed a fiber ring in East Africa, so it's redundant and resilient. There's still some challenges. When we did some work on this, we found that there's still a lot of challenges with the rights-of-way access. You have to go city by city and get permission, and that can add a lot of time, and some cities view that as a great opportunity to tax, so they'll basically double the price of deployment just by asking for licensing fees. There's not much sharing, so if the electric wires or the roads or other rights of way don't get shared as much as they might be. And the problem with this is that even if you have these submarine cables, or especially because of the submarine cables, the cost of international is going down, and people may still use it for tromboning if the cost of getting to the IXP is still too high because of these domestic roadblocks. So that really needs to be harmonized, and a way of sharing the rights of way by the government would be helpful. One significant issue that we found when we did this work was cross-border. There's 16 landlocked countries in Africa that, of course, will never have a landing station. And others, it would be good for them to have access to multiple landing stations for competition. And it's still hard. When we did the study, we found a lot of roadblocks to getting across borders, that you have to coordinate up to one side, and then you have to make sure you've coordinated up to the other, and that's a significant challenge. And there's still not enough capacity necessarily across the continent, and someone did do a study. There are these ripe Atlas probes that people are putting in, and someone just programmed them all to ping other probes across Africa, and showed that there's still some improvements. There's still some double satellite hops to get from one side of Africa to the other, adding almost a second of latency when you go up and down twice. So the measurements are very important in all of this, and there's still some room for more fiber across the countries. On the metro side, we haven't really studied this specifically. I know Google has this Project Link in Kampala, Uganda, where they just chose this country to lay down some fiber, get a license, lay down some fiber, and become a wholesaler to all of the mobile ISPs and the other other companies. And the point of this, they offer an unlimited link. You pay a monthly fee, and apparently you get an unlimited capacity, or at least unlimited within the fiber that's been deployed and the technology. And I haven't seen any results of that, but that seems to be a promising approach, that a private sector company can do that. On the fiber to the home side, I hope I'm wrong. The only place I've seen a little bit is in South Africa, just for obvious reasons. It's not going to be a priority. So what I would say is that there are investments taking place. Government should really think about the roadblocks that they're imposing within the country and at the borders to bring down the costs and the roadblocks to get more capacity, and then people should be thinking about measuring privately and whoever's doing these investments, so that when there's new policies, when there's new investment, we can all see the results of that and identify places like these double satellite hubs where investment could still take place.
Thank you. So let's see that I understand you correctly. The sea cables, you see that the fibers there are actually pretty open and relatively easy to get access to. Was that also true for the fibers on land? Because I think you said that the actual right of way was difficult and sort of exclusive. Is that also for the fiber itself in land?
Well, so the submarine cables, through the investment consortia, they're not just the incumbents anymore. Although I would say that we're not really seeing if the prices are coming down, or at least I haven't seen any studies that show that it's been effective in lowering the cost of transit.
But in land, is there a difference between exclusivity for the right of way and the fiber itself
There's not much sharing. So some companies are building for their own use and not wholesaling it. Liquid is a wholesaler, so they're making it available to others. So it's really country by country whether or not it's exclusive or open for everyone.
Yeah, but in general, the right of way is the problem. Karin, I saw that you wanted to comment, but I want to give the microphone to Tracy first, so we go over all speakers first, and then I'll let you in to discuss. So Tracy, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, which is in the Caribbean region, but I'm also asked to speak on the Pacific region as well. So for all the islands that have challenges with internet access. In the Caribbean, we are quite lucky, actually. As you may know, we are situated between North America and South America. So by luck of geographic location, the Caribbean is actually very well connected, because many of the international operators have to land in one of the islands to connect to other jurisdictions. Some people say the Caribbean may be one of the most connected places on earth. In Puerto Rico, for example, there are 9 landed cables. In Trinidad and Tobago, there are 5, and in British Virgin Islands, which is a very small islands, there are 7 landed cables. The challenge, however, in the islands, and including the Pacific here, is not the fact that connectivity is available via fiber. It's how do you get from the I think it was raised for the African situation just now. But the challenge in the Caribbean is moving from the connectivity at the landing stations into the homes, into the offices, into the environments. And governments and regulators have significant challenges in asking operators to move beyond what is considered to be commercially viable locations. So you'd find in all of the islands, the cities and towns tend to be very well connected in some cases with reasonable access. But as you move out of the cities and towns, the access diminishes quite significantly, and even wireless type access attempts generally fail because many of the islands are volcanic, very, very mountainous, very challenging topographies. So while you may look at a map and see a lot of landed nodes, a lot of connections, the actual access, bringing that into the Caribbean, into the islands, into the Pacific, very, very challenging. So the discussion that I would like to contribute to is, how can we, as the Internet Governance Forum, work with countries like the small island developing states in the Caribbean and Pacific, and the African region and Asian region, to bring connectivity beyond the towns, the villages that have commercially viable propositions. In a large case of the Caribbean, most of the landed cables are owned by foreign interests, as I said, because they're on the way from North America to South America and beyond, in some cases to Europe. So there is no vested interest of those operators or those dark fiber owners in doing anything beyond landing the cable. And it's left to the private sector within these small islands to do that without government intervention, without regulation that that is going to support moving connectivity beyond the urban centers, how do we then provide that access to the next half? So in many countries, you have 25 to 30% connectivity through fiber, in some cases through wireless. The question is, how do you get the other 70% connected? And that question has remained with us quite a few years. And universal service funds notwithstanding, projects that governments have done with access centers notwithstanding, it still remains a challenge to bring fiber to the home, fiber to the curb, fiber to any particular location beyond the urban centers. So that's how I wanted to frame my discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Karin, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to the 2 points of rights of ways. If we look at different regions today, the 2 points that are standing out mostly that hampers the deployment and access to fiber is rights of ways and GIS data accessibility. And that is something that we need to focus on, not only for Africa, but for all regions, also in Europe and the US. I mean, this is an instrument for all landowners to really hamper and slow down the deployment, definitely here in these regions. So that's the point for us to focus on. We've done so for many years. And I also know that my sister council in Africa is focusing a lot on this topic.
Anyone else? Michael?
Yeah, sorry, just to pick up on that, it's true, it is an issue everywhere, and I think 10 years ago I did a study for a tech group in the US called TechNet and on the rights of way, and comparing all 50 and ranking all 50 states on their rights of way policies. And there were huge differences, and kind of the model was a state that took control of their municipalities and said there's one form that you can use, there's one maximum price you can charge, and there's one, and you have, one deadline in which to answer, so that people could go online, know that they're going to get an answer, build into their business plan how much it was going to cost per municipality. And then I think we really have to get in, especially for the metro and long distance fiber, into the sharing issue, that you shouldn't be building a road without putting a duct in, at least, and everyone should know to some degree when others are building in common areas so that they can share those costs.
Thank you. Kwasi?
First, let me reiterate the importance of the landline cables also. They are equally important, and sometimes they are more strategic and critical than marine cables, especially for landlocked countries. That's one. Second, the business of cables, fiber optic cables, should be privately led. Our experience is that when the private sector do these cables, they do it better, more efficient, and with more capacity. While in our region, while the cables from the private sectors was for the capacity of 1.25 tera and 5 terabytes, the cables that were done by governments, like the FOC cable, was only 5 giga, and our cable that links us to Iran, for example, because it's done between 2 ministries of communication, was done only for 500 gig. So this should be also a policy for the privately led initiative, and we should adopt policies that allows that.
So what I hear you start talking about has to do with the right-of-way for the fiber itself, sharing the ducts when the right-of-way actually exists, sharing the fiber when that is actually put into place, and having these projects private sector led. Okay, that's what I heard so far. But what about sort of the ends, the connectivity that we hear Tracy talk about from wherever the end of these fibers, whether they are sea cables or land cables, to the actual end users? There's a gap there as well. Are there specific things that should be done there as well? Is it the same kind of principles for that gap as well? Or is it more unknown? Karin?
Yeah, I can start. I don't know if I have a straight answer to it, but we've done some studies on it, and what we see as a driver, at least, when you have a country connected and then want to get out to the end consumer and customer, in the end. We see a big progress in countries where you have multiple operators acting at the same time. And then you could have a privately owned or multiple privately owned operators or network owners, but also governmental investments competing about the end consumer. Then we see it happening. And then usually we also see new access methods and possibilities to access the end consumer arising, which is also very competitive and interesting to the end consumer. That is what we've seen in some markets. In other markets, there are other incentives for getting connected. So it's not like a clear answer, but we can see a huge step forward in those countries where you have competing operators who wants to get out to the end consumer. And what's interesting is that, for example, in Europe, you can see Deutsche Telekom in Germany acting in one way, but when they're acting outside Germany, they have a totally different agenda, doing it totally differently, which is really interesting. So then it really moves fast, but yeah.
So it moves slower on the home market, right?
More or less, yeah.
Kwasi?
Thank you, Patrick, for the good question. Let's take the example of Kuwait. We have an ambitious project 5 years ago initiated to have fiber to home connectivity. But the ministry went into, let's say, bureaucratic red tape, let's say, obstacles and some infrastructure related issues where they decided to say for the new urban areas, we'll have fiber to home, and then we will think about connecting removing the old copper network and installing new fibers. Well, what happened is that the new urban areas, even from the ISP business, they can offer high bandwidth capacities because they have fibers. They are connected directly with the JPEG cards and switches. But for areas where I live, for example, where we have a copper network, where the best performance cannot give me more than a 2 meg, these areas became the market for the wireless mobile operators or the ISPs who operate on the last mile. Let's say the last mile, they have a wireless technology. So in a way that created a kind of imbalance for the ISP.
So it is imbalance, but at the same time there's competition between the various access
we have 5 ISPs
mechanisms.
in Kuwait, and we have 3 mobile operators, and they all offer internet connectivity, so there is a competition. But this competition, because of infrastructure reasons, there is a kind of imbalance.
So just so I understand, the competition is on national level, but in reality, depending on the infrastructure, you always have one of those being dominant. If there is fiber, you have the fiber operators. If there is not fiber, then you use other mechanisms. Yeah.
The regular ISP can connect you, but you cannot get a performance than 2 meg. So I go wirelessly, and I have higher.
Yeah. Yes, Alicia.
Okay. No, it's on. It's on.
It is on.
Yeah. Actually, it's here. It's on. Okay. I mean that regarding the fiber, regarding the fiber access in Iran. I mean that we have, as I said, we have an operator that actually signed a contract and run it as a pilot project for Iranians, for 8 million Iranians in 2 major cities, and they want to do that. But the only that there are 2 things. One of them is that because the e-commerce in Iran actually, I mean that most of them based on, I mean that the old methods, and e-commerce is not, I mean that very. It is developing very fast, but actually it's not the majority of the business in e-commerce. So that's why I mean that it's going very slowly, and also I mean that and so the size of business is not that big, and because the infrastructure owned by the government, and that this kind of project actually should be owned by the private sectors, but technically because I mean that it belongs to the government, it's going too slowly. And the other thing that the fiber connections to the homes are not very fast in Iran, because most of the users using the mobiles to access to the internet or to go shopping or access to the internet, because there are not enough that higher speed required contents in the country. So I think that that it's more motivation to the mobile operators and wireless that actually give the connectivities to the wireless devices, as my friend said. So I think that this is this.
Thank you. Tracy?
So one of the challenges, again, that we have is, so listening to gentleman from Kuwait, the bringing fiber into the islands and getting wireless to come up, you still need to bring something to the nodes or the points that will provide the access in those wireless areas. Again, because of topography, because of commercial non-viability, you tend to find, even on the wireless side, even if there's connectivity, the private operators are not encouraged or motivated to bring up even wireless connectivity. In the Caribbean, you tend to find duopoly type operations where they are both wireless and fiber, they own fiber and they run mobile networks as well. But even when that happens, you still do not find the underserved areas that have been identified, which are not commercially viable, being addressed in any great sense. The solution has been, in many of those islands, to have government intervention. So the governments have to find a way to incentivize those private operators. There must be some level of public-private partnership where either they use universal service funds or they demand or mandate that you connect these communities using some project. In Toronto, we use the concept of access centers, where in order to connect a community at a certain speed, you have to run fiber. You have to. There's no two ways about it, and wireless will not cut it. So in the islands, we believe that there is a government role to play, or a regulatory role to play, to demand, if you want to use that word, or to insist, or to morally sway operators to move into the non-commercially viable areas. And in some cases, when they do move, the operators themselves are surprised that they're not commercially viable before, according to their calculations. But as soon as they go into the area, you tend to find it's one operator moving into the area, and they have effective monopolies in those areas, because once one moves in, they are by themselves, so they're able to connect up an entire 1,000 households and itself make that connection very viable. So there are some creative ways that we need to look at these issues, and in the small states, in the small islands, to have that situation looked at through public-private partnerships.
So Michael, you mentioned that for this fiber that was up for 2 days, a person could sort of use Skype with video. That's as a positive thing. It sounds on a lot when I talk to people about fiber, just like we hear, that everyone locally want to use the fiber, connect to something somewhere else. And Kwasi even mentioned that when the fiber was cut, no one could use the internet. Of course they could use it locally, okay? So I have a question about providers of services. I presume that quite often they're actually hosted abroad, even though the provider of the service is local. Is that changing when a fiber is connected? So when you get higher bandwidth, do the services move locally, or is it the other way around? Or there's no relationship with, don't you know? You're shaking your head, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing a study on this in Rwanda, and there seems to be no relationship. I mean, they have good fiber connectivity now through Tanzania, through Uganda or Kenya, but there doesn't seem to be any relationship because it's, for the content providers, it's always cheaper to host abroad, and they'll host abroad until they start realizing we can talk about it, but until they start realizing the implications that they're causing on the ISPs. And of course, when prices come down on the fiber, it costs less to bring it back, but it still imposes a latency and a significant cost on the ISPs.
Yeah. Karin?
Well, yeah, I agree with you. And what we see is also that they want to centralize it, because you have also the possibility to maintain it in a different way. If you put it out locally, you need persons to take care of it, and you have other costs surrounding this. But they want to centralize it, to have bigger hubs, to be able to maintain it more professionally.
Also, the local businesses then choose to have it abroad, just because they are attracting customers all over the world, of course, and not only local.
Yeah, that's a new business plan of today.
Kwasi?
Of course, we would always want to localize the traffic. As much as we reduce the upstream traffic, that means we are also reducing the cost of access because we are saving on bandwidth. But it's a challenge for us to do that. Not only that, IXPs is still for us is a challenging issue. We may not necessarily, we have IXPs, but they are not properly set up, or it is based like on an initiative between a group of ISPs, but not yet a well-established organization, let's say. In the region, for example, in the Middle East, we don't have yet an ISP Tier 2 network. We are all Tier 3. So these are all challenges that addresses the question. So we hope one day.
So you say that even said that local traffic exchange between ISPs is difficult. That to some degree what you talked about as well, Michael, that even though you have good traffic from an ISP in a country in Africa to whatever globally, but to a neighboring ISP, specifically like in a neighboring country, might be as bad as before, even though you have fiber, right?
Yeah, I think that's getting better, but I think that actually relates a lot to this point. When people start talking about local content or content hosted locally, it's usually interpreted very literally that every country has to host everything. And I think that if you think about regionalization and trying to build up some scale and having a regional hub the way Amsterdam or London is in Europe, then you can start to build up the scale and get the price down for the hosting. Mm-hmm. But then you have to have really kind of harmonized, just like in the EU or other regions, harmonization so you can cross the borders very cheaply and build up some scale.
Tracy, that problem with non-localized content and services, that if I understand correctly, that has been the history in South America and Latin America region all the time, right? Where all transmission is sort of star-shaped from Miami, which means that Miami has sort of more or less been the best location, best within quotes. But I understand that that is getting better with connectivity, also cross-connectivity between countries in Latin America region, right?
So in the Latin American Caribbean region, we do have an IXP project that has been underway for the last, I think, about 5 years. So we do have, as you said, it's kind of a pear-shaped or tower-shaped, or whatever the direction is, a sort of a download culture environment in the region. All content is being drawn from the US-type servers. With the IXP proliferation, we've begun to see some modification to that. However, until the local content begins to actually emerge in many of the islands, in this case, in my case, I can't speak for Latin America fully, we're still going to have that challenge where unless caching servers are brought into the territories, you're going to still see heavy traffic out of Miami in our case, and I guess in Australia and Asia in the case of Asia Pacific. In Trinidad and Tobago, we've recently, another challenge we have obviously is within the IXP, whether the operators themselves are going to collaborate entirely. In some cases, on the IXPs, only 2 operators are connected, and that is not helpful in those situations. So again, there are internal challenges and they have to deal with to ensure that those situations are rectified.
Yeah, local content. I was actually waiting for someone to mention that, specifically when we are when we're here also sort of on initiative by people from the Farsi-speaking region in the world, where of course the local content is kind of interesting, specifically because you also use different scripts across the region. We have 2 questions from the audience. Let's start in the back. Just wait, your microphone is not on. Can someone help the gentleman with the microphone? Oh, thank you. You're working on it.
Hello. Okay. All right. My name is Seun Ojedeji. I'm from Nigeria, and I'm attending this event as an ISOC ambassador. I just want to ask a question. What is your experience in relation to how your ISPs handle local content against the international content? By local content, I mean for instance, Google servers, cache servers are around most countries. and against pulling the content directly from the US, for example. In my country, Nigeria, we pay by data size, right? So we pay for 5 gig, you pay certain amounts, and you still get charged for the same amount of data you pull locally compared to what you pull internationally. So I'm thinking that if you have local content, if they've cached those content, they should not actually be removing the data from what you have bought already. So do you have an experience in your country? I mean, is your ISPs actually giving preference to accessing local content free without charging from the internet? And
Michael, you wanted to have the word first. Yeah.
So we did a study of the impact of the Google caches, and we looked at it in Nigeria. It wasn't just on Google, but we were looking at the impact of IXPs in Kenya and Nigeria, and did see that the Google cache had exactly this impact. Significant amount of new traffic because it was local and it was quicker to download, resulting in a lot of new revenue for the ISPs and lower costs that weren't directly passed on because there was one data charge. So just on that question of the data charge, I think it's been tried in South Africa and Chile that if you access local content, it doesn't go against your data plan, but that was on DSL plans. And I think they have always the challenge of how do you know it's local when you're downloading, and how do you know it's going to be free. But that has been tried in 2 countries. I haven't seen any studies, unfortunately, to see the impact.
Thank you. Kwasi?
Let's take, for example, how the ISPs in Kuwait, they created their own IXP. Because they are lucky enough to be in the same building, so they created a mesh between themselves. So each IXP has a cable from his switch to the other, and they localize the content inside Kuwait. So when I used to access my online banking or accessing a local newspaper where the traffic used to hit the States and come back, now through this mesh, which is not a proper setup, but it's a practical and it's working, right? It's now totally local. And when the Sumway 4 cable was cut off, this was operational. So it helped in a way, but it's not the proper setup. But today, the local content that we're talking about, and I will reiterate the point of my colleague, is not the newspaper or my online banking or the day trading. It's the Google, it's the social networks. That's the global. I want to have them a regional base in my region where the traffic can be localized for them, because this is my highest traffic. I want WhatsApp, which is peer-to-peer, to have a regional hub. That's the localization of the company, because this is the mainstream, upstream traffic that goes on.
So you want Google and others to move into the very same building where your bank and newspaper is, right?
Somewhere there.
Yes.
How close?
Yes. So we have a question here in the front, and then we have one here in the middle.
Thank you. Yahya from Sudan. I'm from the regulator of Sudan. And thank you for the discussion of these very hot topics for us, actually. I just completely agree with my brother Qusay that the submarine cable goes to another hub, where that hub affects the availability, and the link cost affects the cost of the service definitely in our countries. For example, in Sudan, we have many optical fiber submarine cables, Flag, as he mentioned, Easy, SAS 1 and 2 connecting us to Saudi Arabia, but still the retail price is very high. For the universities, for example, it costs $100 per megabit per second. For the organization, it is 500 megabit for 1 megabit per second per month. Yes, the internet for users is much better in terms of prices. It costs maybe $1 per week because of the sharing is very high. And now we have 10 million subscribers out of 30 million, 10 million from 30 million. But still the quality is questionable. So my question is, we are completely different from the case of Iran, where all the submarine cables and landing station owned by private companies, which are the operators actually. So as a country, we cannot manage this very well as the case of when the government owns the gateways and the infrastructure. Accordingly, I think we need to work around to find a way to lower the cost for the customers. And this needs to be done globally because the cost now affected the quality of the service that we have and affected our broadband plan, actually. So what do you think about it?
So I want to follow up to understand your question. You said that the price for the end users is still high, but you see that the wholesale prices are low for whatever the services the ISPs need. So why is the cost high in your country, you think? And I'm asking you because you also said you were from the regulator. You must have investigated this.
Yeah, because the operators, they got the cost from the other points. They got point-to-point connection from our country, for example, to Saudi Arabia, and then from the internet through Europe, definitely. And the cost of that submarine cable and the end point-to-point link is very high for them. So the cost became very high for us.
Okay, so but that means that the wholesale price of that specific piece of the product they are building is expensive.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, yeah.
And the regulator cannot manage this. As a regulator now, I cannot manage this to lower the prices. So it's because it's a completely private one. So, you know, it's...
Any comment? Anyone that knows about the situation in Sudan? Kwasi?
Again, that brings the issue of a privately led or privately invested marine cables. When the private sector invested in marine cables, like Tata, Lucent, Alcatel in our region, they marketed their marine cables well. So they brought more international carriers to our region, where now I can enjoy a better competition and better pricing schemes, and competitive pricing scheme for my data, and even the services. As a result, 3 years ago, the price of the international circuits has been reduced by 20%. Actually, 2 months ago, the Ministry of Communication reduced again the cost of international circuits by 20%. But this depends again on the skill of negotiation with the international carriers and the volume of traffic and what goes on. But for example, when the Falcon or the GCC Bridge Falcon cable, which is now 5 terabyte, the price of the international circuit on this cable is now by far less than the FOC cable, which is only 5 gigabit bandwidth, and nobody wants to use it. So which is better, the one done by the government or the one done by the private sector?
So what you're talking about, yes, you're comparing private and public sector, but what I think you really talk about is the need for competition also on the wholesale side, right?
In the private sector, because they want to have a return of investment, they are keen to bring more international carriers to the region and let them operate through the cables, and that will create competitive schemes.
So in your case, it seems to be the case that what I hear Costa saying is that for that specific high price wholesale sort of link, there is no competition. Your local ISPs cannot buy transmission any other path. Is that correct, right? Yeah, okay, thank you. Next question in the middle.
Good morning. My name is Lacier, and telecom operator in Brazil. With operation of submarine fiber in these regions, do not encourage of participating in traffic exchange points and with to optimize the traffic.
Can you repeat that? I don't think I didn't understand.
The question is, why operators of submarine fiber in these regions, especially from a Brazilian perspective, do not optimize the traffic points of exchange data? That's the main question, because he's an operator in Brazil, and he's thinking about why you're talking a lot about fiber, and why you do not talk about like exchange points of traffic. That's the question.
Yeah. We have a person here in the audience that wanted to comment on that.
I am Ariel Greiser from Argentina, and I run the IXPs there. I understand the question and try to say that South America is similar to your region. We have small cables or small quantity of cables, but the problem is in the whole market, as Patrick said, is the price per quantity. And they need to get the return on investment on the investment on the cable. And the proposition of the man from Brazil is that the amount of traffic that you can exchange locally, as the example of the building you said. But the problem is how you deal with the caches and the other content to be hosted locally, because in our region, for example, local content is no more than the 10% that our users are using. The Google cache, for example, in our country is more or less the 35% of the total content that we have. So our issue is to try to get more content locally based on caches or other CDNs, trying to get in our internet exchange points most of the traffic that we can, instead to going abroad to try to find the traffic. I guess this is your point.
You can hand over the microphone to the gentleman in front of you, please.
Hi, I'm Christian Kaufmann from Akamai, so I guess I'm one of these content people with the caches.
Yes.
In general, and I think this is true for Google as well, in general, as we are in the business of bringing content closer to the end user, which is a global statement, right? That is not just for the Western Hemisphere. We try to bring them in every country. And I think especially like in Africa, Latin America, we actually make quite some progress in the last years. For the countries which do not have caches today, the reasons are either from a legal perspective, because we got to check from a legal perspective if we are actually liable for the content which we transport, which in our case is not true because we are not owning it, or if there are any other issues which we have to take care about. So it actually takes some time. The other point is, depending on where we connect, if we put caches in a network, which is easier, or if you go to an IX, and now comes the funny point, if you go to an IX, we have to fill the caches as well, right? The content which is somewhere else in the world has to come to the cache. So at the moment where we start going to an IX and we buy transit, whatever price you have, like this $100, $200, $1,000, now we have to pay as well, which actually destroys every business case in going to an IX. So we talk to a lot of IXs in the world, especially also in emerging markets, and we try to find ways around that. And I guess in some cases we were quite successful. South Africa is one of the points, or others, but it takes some time to talk about it and find a way. It is not a straightforward approach like somewhere in the US or in Europe where you just buy it and it's more like a commodity thing. You have to find a way around the pricing and the issues in the particular countries.
So it sounds a little bit like a catch-22 problem, that the prices are high as long as there's not more traffic, but on the other hand, the prices don't go down unless you have more local traffic, which you don't get unless you have the caches there that don't want to pay the high prices. Okay, so nothing happens.
It is a catch-22 or 21. That is true.
Port 21, yes.
But there are ways around, like when you start deploying caches in the networks itself, because then it helps, right? It gets faster for the particular network, but it's also getting cheaper for the country.
And also for the peers of that specific network locally, right? In the cases that is allowed and happens.
Well, see, this is now one of the points, just very quickly. We figured out that we want to put caches in a network. Every network is more or less happy about it because it helps them a lot. In the moment where we ask if they actually want to share that benefit with the competitors to help the country and the region, they are not so motivated anymore. So some do, most of them not.
Anyone in the panel that would like to say something on this topic? Michael? Yeah.
I heard somebody say that, that 10% of the traffic is local and 35% is the Google cache. But in some sense, wouldn't you consider that to be local? I mean, it's not. I mean, from the point of view of the ISP, from the point of view of saving the cost, and surely it's locally hosted or locally relevant, but not created locally. Because, and then I think, the argument has to be for hosting these caches, and I know Akamai is now, is really starting to move around these regions as well, that the savings are enormous, right? Whatever the cost of the transit, it's got to be 3 for 1, right? You bring it in once and you save, quite a bit of money on not bringing it in over and over. But again, the competitive issues get in the way.
But it ends up, but there's also different on who pays for those bits, right? So, yeah. Please.
First of all, I would like to thank our panelists for interesting presentations. I have two closely interrelated questions. I wonder, actually, you have already reflected upon those, but still, I wonder how active your regulators have been in ensuring competitive environments for private interest, as our panelists from Kuwait mentioned, to expand infrastructure in terms of ensuring effective rights-of-way conditions, infrastructure sharing, joint construction. The situation with Iran is more or less understandable, where the state still controls the bulk or the whole of the infrastructure. But in other countries like African region, the Caribbean, Kuwait, and as our panelist from the Caribbean region mentioned about Universal Service Fund, I wonder whether the establishment of such a fund has been a successful experience for boosting the deployment of broadband infrastructure. Thank you.
Can you present yourself, please?
I'm from Armenia. I represent a civil society organization, and at the same time, I'm an ICT expert working on internationally funded projects.
Thank you. Anyone that would like to respond on that? Tracy?
I could respond to the last point. Again, the results are varied. In the islands, you would find that there are, as I said, creative ways of trying to deal with it. So most Universal Service Fund projects tend to be at bringing access to underserved areas through schools, community centers, and access centers. However, there hasn't been a direct focus on bringing broadband per se to those areas. So it's access, whatever kind of access it is, wireless access and so on. I think there's a creative approach that some countries have taken. My country has done that, in that you have to insist that the access in those areas, the schools, the centers and so on, must be broadband, must be fiber in some cases. In that way, we've seen in my country where the network expands by mandate. So the broadband network, which only reached X and Y, can now go to Z. We haven't seen a lot of that in the islands, and I think that has to change. I think government has a role to play, because the limit has been to bring access. The interest of most governments is simply bring access, not about bringing high-speed access, but broadband access. So that is slowly adjusting, slowly changing. And I think the Universal Service Fund is where that can happen, because you're not going to find most operators bringing new access, new types of access in those areas. They'll bring what they have. So they'll bring copper, or they'll bring wireless at its lowest levels, and edge type networks. So you wouldn't see the LTE or the HSPA type networks rolling out. So it has to be a creative way, and I think it has to be defined. So when governments or regulators say bring access, they need to qualify that by saying what kind of access to bring. And it's now changing, but because you've reached the areas already with some of the funds, it's very difficult to go back to the operators now and say, well, you've reached them, now I need to double up on that and to bring a different type of access. So it's a double-edged sword in that regard, with some success.
Thank you. So in the far back there, please.
Yeah, my name is Christian Havelek. I'm from Leibniz University of Hanover. I have a background in IT law, so I'm a bit a white elephant here, and my apologies if my question is trivial. But what I would like to know about is how you would see the future relation or competitiveness of satellite internet versus fiber optics, because I see the issue of latency for geostationary satellites, but there's still the low Earth orbit approach, which I think has been tried a couple of years ago. It didn't really work out, I think, for commercial reasons, but what I do see, if I look at especially at the African situation, that we now have this fiber optic ring around Africa, and we address all the port cities, but we still have lots of issues to get into the core land of Africa, whereas I would think, from my non-expert view, that satellite internet might be a very good way to directly address end users all over the continent. Would you agree to that, or is that a bit too naive in my thought? Thank you.
Karin and then Kwasi.
I wouldn't agree to that.
Oh, I'm surprised.
No,
but I'm pretty sure that you have been looking around,
yes,
looking at it, and you get the question all the time.
Yeah, we get the question all the time, and in most panels I sit in, I always get the question about mobile versus fiber or satellite versus fiber. I don't think there is a competition between them. I think we need complementary infrastructures, and fiber will be a basic infrastructure for offloading and for fiber to the home in some cases, most cases I would hope, and to businesses and ISPs to get their services out there. Of course, both mobile and satellite will be complementary. We have places up in Sweden even where you see a lot of fiber to the home which we can't reach with fiber to the home. Satellite is an option, of course. I think we need to be aware of the need of capacity and redundancy and the limitations we see with other infrastructures.
Kwasi?
I disagree. When I just mentioned in my first intervention that we used to pay $200 per month for a dial-up, that is because our connection at that time was satellite-based and the tariffs were totally expensive. If it wasn't for the marine cables, we wouldn't pay $600 to $700 today for a 10 MB. But definitely, as my dear colleague said, it can complement in terms, it can be a backup, it can be an emergency, it can be a way for the remote areas or where there are geographical obstacles that may let the fiber or such a thing cannot be connected. But again, even today, we have a private satellite telephone service which is called Thuraya, which covers our region, but it didn't pick up that much. It is still for remote areas. So they will not compete because satellite, as of today, will lose cost-wise. But it can be a backup, it can be an emergency, it can be used for in case of disasters as a quick setup and so on.
And there are places, Karin started to talk about Sweden, and there are places in northern Sweden, and even north of Sweden, where satellites doesn't work really well. And I've been helping one project, a ship going north of Russia, and of course all the new operating systems from Apple and Microsoft requires connections to licensing server to be able to work, which is not so good up there because you don't even have satellite internet. So they downgraded some of their computers to Windows XP and other versions that doesn't require internet connection, and that's kind of interesting as well. So low orbit satellites may be good for people that are as short as me, but not for tall ones. Sarah?
I just want to bring another issue regarding the prices, because the prices still in Iran for the internet transition is high, because actually the protocol that they're using is old ones. I mean that they're using that because they're coming from the telecommunication background. The people that are working at the infrastructure, they're using the kind of the synchronized protocols like SDM1, SDM4 or something. So actually they are not utilizing the fibers very well. So I mean that there is one suggestion that actually changing the protocol and better utilize the fibers that they're they're using. So I mean that this is one of the issues that that I think that we currently have regarding the high prices. So I don't know very much about the situation in other countries that how they that utilize the fibers. But I mean this is one of the main issues that currently we have.
But when you and I talked, I still understood that deployment of fiber between and connecting the actual sort of other upstream end of the copper cables, the DSL, has helped the actual access for the, even though you use DSL for the access network, right?
Yes. Yes, I mean that the connectivity is over. That the connectivity for the end user is ADSL over the coppers. But I mean, for example, if you want to buy some bandwidth from the Ministry of Telecom, for example, the huge amount of bandwidth, actually it calculates it based on the STM1, STM4. So I think that you can see in the news that, for example, the Ministry of Telecom says that we established 3 STM1s instead of, for example, says that we established 2 10 gig internet. So that's the problem. So we have, because of the infrastructure that currently is being used in Iran is based, I think that it's based on the old way of transition, which is STM5. Okay. It's not utilizing the fiber as well.
Thank you. We have another question there in the back, please.
Hi, I'm Mike Jensen from the Association of Progressive Communications. I've been involved in a number of submarine and terrestrial fiber technical and feasibility studies. And I just wanted to agree with the suggestion that satellite and other non-fiber technologies are seen as an interim solution as opposed to a permanent alternative. Roll out satellite into remote areas before the fiber gets there. We've seen this across the continent in Africa, and actually now fiber is reaching to the home, is now in being implemented not only in South Africa but Mauritius, Tanzania, Kenya, and a number of countries in North Africa. So I think we will see the growth of fiber to the home inevitably at some point. It's just a question of when. I think some of the key issues around this are also that we're now seeing gigabit Wi-Fi commercially available, quite easily available this year, and next year there will be 10 gigabit Wi-Fi. So this is another interim solution, so you don't actually have to wait for the fiber to get there to get a high bandwidth connection. You can bridge your last mile, do your backup with significant power under microwave technologies these days. In terms of the licensing and regulatory environment, I think one of the factors that is very key is dig once policies. We know that the deployment of fiber terrestrially, up to 70 or even 90% of the cost is in the civil works. So if this is done once, any operator that digs for their fiber must lay other ducts so that other operators can come in and lay their own ducts. Similarly, the plans of the operators must be published, and interestingly, example in Nigeria, where this is a law now, they also required, if they're running their fiber within 1 kilometer of a public institution, they must lay dark fiber to that institution. So that's an interesting example, and in fact I think the Universal Service Fund there is also planning on subsidizing the extension of the fiber networks into more remote and rural areas. By the same token, though, we also have countries in Africa where they've received funding for a open access submarine fiber landing station where all of the local ISPs had an ownership in it, and then the decision was reversed and effectively the submarine cable landing station was nationalized, and ISPs now have to buy at the set price that the government decides how much revenue it wants to earn. Final point is, in connecting continents, I think we have to really also be aware of those difficult cases in between. I think what we're going to see is a real divide with this very small island states with low populations out in remote areas which don't have the possibility to get connect to fiber very cost effectively. And if there are any opportunities where ships are passing nearby or cables can be rerouted to ensure that these small island states are connected, I think it's an important point to bear in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I was thinking of now we have another 11 minutes to give, let the panelists, and I'll start from the left, let's say, to make it easy for me. What would be your recommendation to someone to make the internet access and make the situation better. Let me be unspecific. And you can decide who you're giving the recommendation to, what you mean by being better, and also it can be local, in your country, in the area, in the world. What would your recommendation be? Tracy, let's start with you.
Okay, so I'm going to be a little provocative. So I strongly believe that the government has a significant role to play in that. Governments do need to work closely with the private sector in doing this. It can't, at this stage of internet deployments, it can't only be about commercial viability. It has to be about the public good and what's in the public interest at this stage of deployment. So I think a recommendation going forward is for governments to work closely, not on their own, and private sector not to work on their own, to work closely together in all countries, especially in the small islands, to ensure that their regulators and their internet agencies, the ICT agencies, and the private sector, the operators and so on, work closely together, some sort of task force being set up to establish exactly what the requirements are, where the deficiencies are, and what they can do together, working together in a multi-stakeholder model to bring the access to everybody at this stage of internet deployments. I think we're talking about satellites and even white spaces and so on, but all these things are little drops in the bucket, little point solutions to try and solve small problems. We need to solve big problems with big solutions. So work together, bring the regulations up to speed, don't work in silos, and ensure that all stakeholders and all target audiences are reached that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Karin?
Well, I would like to focus my recommendation to Europe. As we are also here in Istanbul today, I think it's interesting to see on the rankings that it's one of the most spurring fiber to the home markets for the moment. And there are 2 points I would like to send out to decision makers in Europe. One is on the policy and regulatory side regarding operators. Incumbent operators needs to be hardly pushed to get on the track in Europe. We have good examples, we need to use them more. On the other side, I also want to focus on the end consumer. We need to realize better what the end consumer needs, wants, and would like to pay for, and how they could pay for it. That is the only way we will see an uptake in these networks and also get the business models rolling better.
Thank you. Kwasi?
Let me add to what my colleague said. There got to be a model where the operators are accountable to all the countries that this cable serves, whether operational or even to the safety of that cable. Because it's crucial. If the safety of this cable is jeopardized, that means I'm cut off. That's it. So there got to be a model where all the parties involved, there is an accountability model to operate, and again, the safety of that cable. This is what I will add.
Thank you. Alireza?
Actually, I was thinking about saying that, I mean, I'll let all the stakeholders come and participate in this, but I think that in the current situation, if I just want to focus on in Iran, I think that if we let the private sector comes forward and they do what they, and then they start building something, I think that would be benefit the country, because actually that they grow faster, and then the size of the size of this business, which is the internet business, is getting high, and the company is getting more motivated to come and invest. I think that the best would be let the private sector in a country comes and that start business in this area.
Thank you. Michael, you got the last word.
Well, I'll just build up on that a little bit. I mean, I think it's important. I would aim this at governments mainly, that fiber is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. And we talk about creating an enabling environment. And in the case of fiber, I think it's very important how it's deployed to keep the cost down, to remove the roadblocks, to make sure that it's competitive, and put in place a way of measuring the results to make sure that there's not just, I think someone talked, there's one little roadblock that we heard about that one little area where there's no competition that raises the price and keeps the benefits from everyone. So I think it's really important to watch it throughout, and then we get into these content issues, which is a whole separate issue, and I think the government would have less role there. But I think it's really to create a good enabling environment that it's deployed the right way.
Thank you very much. So I would like to thank all of you in the audience for coming here. I would like to thank the panelists, and I think it's time for lunch. Thank you.
Hello. This is the French version.